Hi everyone, welcome to my dining room. So today we're going to start talking about chapter 34. This is from Nixon to Carter. So the first two sections, it's President Richard Nixon. He wins in 1968 and then 1972 by a landslide. But then it's found out that there's some dealings that are taking place within his administration that were not legal. His enemies were being spied on by people very close to Nixon. And the question was, does he know about it? Did he not know about it? So articles of impeachment, one article, obstruction of justice, was drawn up. And they were going to impeach him, but he ended up resigning. And Gerald Ford, who was his vice president, becomes president. Gerald Ford finishes out Nixon's term, but then in 1976, we're going to get Jimmy Carter, an outsider. He's going to come in and he's going to get elected in 1976, and that's going to take us through his administration. So that's why this goes from 1968 up until 1980. In chapter 35, that's the Reagan administration. It's like this conservative revolution that takes place during that time. So that's chapter 35. We should get through it, and then 36 is 9/11. And so we'll finish out. So anyway, let's go ahead and get started with section 1. So section 1 is the Nixon years. Excuse me. And this just talks about Richard Nixon's presidency, what's going on with the environment, with foreign affairs, and the economy and things like that. Okay, so when Nixon gets elected, keep in mind that this is a very tumultuous time period. You had people protesting the Vietnam War, there had been the civil rights movement and everything else. And so Nixon really appealed to those people who were middle class, people who wanted law and order, they wanted safety and stability, right? They weren't the shouters, they weren't the protesters. Nixon called them the silent majority. Right, so the silent majority helped him to win election twice. And studies show and sociologists tell us that people don't like chaos. They want stability in their life. Okay, and then another thing that he did is he was seeking welfare reform. So from the Great Society, the government's spending on all of these different programs, but what Nixon said is this hasn't secured or this hasn't alleviated poverty. We're just creating this huge bureaucracy of government organizations, and we saw people who were living in poverty, and people became more and more dependent on it. If you look at the slide right here, I mean, just look at that. In 1960, there were only 5.9 million people who were on welfare, but then by 1970, that doubled, right? More than doubled. So what he wanted to do was try to alleviate those programs that weren't beneficial and to, save the taxpayers some money. So I've got some slides in here, and that's why this is 41 slides long. So we're going to go through some of these pretty quickly. So notice that welfare spending was very, very low. At 1900, 1940s, it went up, and that's due to the Great Depression. Right, and then what we're going to get after the Great Society, which was after 1960, just a huge spike in welfare spending. It really went up to, it went down during the Reagan years and the first Bush years, but then there's going to be another spike during the Obama administration, and then it's kind of come back down. Well, now it's way back up because of everything that's going on right now. All right, and then here's unemployment benefits. They kind of keep in line with the welfare benefits, right? When people are unemployed, they get unemployment payments, and then they might need welfare as well. Some people, though, currently in the current situation, it seems that they can get paid more in unemployment than they were going to get if they were at work. But anyway, we'll see how all this falls out. It'll be interesting. Here's some more slides right here. Notice that medical services is kind of leveled off. But the payments for that, so people are getting the same amount of services, or the government's spending the same amount on services, but the price for those services is really increasing, and so that kind of attests to the fact how expensive healthcare is in the United States. All right, and then this looks at poverty, the percent of people who live in poverty. So if you notice from 1950, it really does come down. So that shows that there were some big gains made in alleviating poverty, especially for African Americans. But then it's really leveled off. We have maintained kind of like this 13% poverty rate in the United States since the Great Society. Notice, though, that those people who live in poverty overwhelmingly, and we've talked about this before, they like 25% of African Americans live in poverty. And if you look here, it's very high for Hispanic Americans too. That's been going down, though. You can see. This is my dog. Come here, Lucy. Come here. You say hi. There it is. Okay, okay. Now get down. Sorry about that. Okay, so if you look too by county in the United States, you can see where people are the poorest, right? So this we have talked about this before. This area right here, you can't really see it with that color. But you guys know right along here, this is known as the Black Belt. And then you have a large Hispanic population here, and then also here, and then also in California. So those are locations where more people are receiving government assistance, and that's where minorities typically live. Okay, so this slide right here, it looks at poverty from a different perspective. This is the number of children under the age of 18 living in poverty, and this goes up to 2010. If you look, though, right up here, this area, this was really dropping, right? The number who were living in poverty, that was a pretty significant drop, like 10%. But then we were going to get the recession of 2008, and those numbers go up really across the board. It's not just for African American or Hispanics, but you can see up there that there are more Hispanic and African American children living in poverty than there are, white children or on average people in the United States. And there could be a lot of factors for that. I mean, you can look at it, it's multiple causation. Some people might say that it's racism. A lot of people would say that if you're living in a single family home, that could be a factor as well. Okay, so if you look at that, the proportion of married families and female-headed families living in poverty. So if you look up here at this one, so here we have children living in poverty, that's like 60%. There's also about 60% of children born in the Black community are to single-parent homes. So if you have two parents, then you presumably have two incomes, right? Or one could work while the other one is caring for a child. And so oftentimes that's where you get, here you've got married families right here, white, less than, I mean, it's about 5% living in poverty. And even that too, Black married families, the poverty rate there is kind of at the average for the nation. So there's a lot of different studies, and as I said, there's a lot of different factors looking at this. And they've been trying to address welfare ever since the Great Society. We're going to get that done, the way that Richard Nixon looks at it, and then there's going to be a real transformation during Bill Clinton's administration. So I want you to keep this in mind because it's something that's been taking place in our nation's history. You go back to the Great Depression when they started a lot of these programs, and then the Great Society really is when it became entrenched in our society. Okay, here's some other ones, poverty rates by age. So younger people more likely to live in poverty, people my age less likely. People who are older, they used to live in poverty, but then, now with Social Security and 401ks and other programs, less likely. I know that my mother, she had a very fixed income and it was difficult for her. So what were Nixon's plans for welfare reform? This is really bizarre, actually, because he was a Republican and he's proposing something very similar to what Andrew Yang was proposing, which was a basic minimum income for people. I know when I was getting my master's, my African American studies professor said, I really liked Richard Nixon. And I was like, what? and it was because of this program right here. But anyway, you would get a minimum income, and then there would be other benefits, welfare benefits that would be taken care of for like healthcare and that sort of thing for the states. But to get that income, if you were an able-bodied adult, you'd have to be enrolled in some work program or job training to get it. So this was rejected by the Senate. So it never came to fruition, but it was something that was proposed by him as a way of kind of alleviating that. And if you're going to get people off the welfare rolls, then you need to give them job training, right? Kind of like a Job Corps. What we did get, though, during Nixon's administration was this new federalism. And rather than the federal government kind of overseeing everybody in all of the states, money would go out to the states for these programs, and then the states would get to decide. So some states are more lenient on their welfare roles and regulations than other states, right? And so now it's kind of put in state hands, and that's all part of federalism. Okay, so another aspect, though, of Richard Nixon and his presidency and his support was trying to win over the South. Now, the South had been Democrats ever since before the Civil War, and then definitely during the Civil War and after the Civil War. Now, Black Southerners voted for Republicans. That started to switch during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's administration. But white Southerners start to switch to the Republican Party during Nixon's administration. And part of that is because, and I don't know if Nixon was racist or what, but he used these policies to win over conservative white voters in the South. So he doesn't want any more civil rights legislation. He's like, we've got enough, or he wasn't going to pursue them. It's not that maybe he didn't want them. It's just not something that they were going to do. He wasn't going to push for the desegregation of schools, and he was opposed to, or he wasn't going to push busing either. He also appoints conservatives to the Supreme Court. Earl Warren, who had been the Chief Justice, he was appointed by Dwight Eisenhower, and he oversaw a lot of the more I guess, civil rights rulings, the more liberal civil rights rulings during that time. So Nixon appoints a man who's more conservative by the name of Warren Burger. He also appoints like 3 other justices to the Supreme Court, and then it becomes pretty firmly entrenched as a conservative voice and conservative branch of government. Okay, so this is Warren Burger right here, who replaced Earl Warren, or actually, yep, this is Warren Burger. He becomes Chief Justice in '69, and he's going to stay there until 1986. And then Ronald Reagan's going to appoint William Rehnquist as the Chief Justice, and then under George W. Bush, he's going to appoint John Roberts, who is the current Chief Justice. Right. But anyway, here we're going to see a lot of very important civil rights, or actually Supreme Court rulings, abortion, capital punishment, religious establishments, and then also like separation of church and state when it comes to religion, school desegregation, right? Those sorts of things, all during his tenure as Chief Justice. Okay, so the economy, we had this weird instance. Usually, when we get unemployment, then prices go down. So when unemployment goes up and people are out of work, fewer people are buying products, and so producers lower the price. It makes sense because you want to sell your goods. The opposite was occurring here. So prices were going up while unemployment was going up, and this is called stagflation. Right? So it could lead to a recession, it could lead to a depression because it would just slow everything down. So what does Nixon do during this period of stagflation? That too is really weird and surprising because he was a Republican. Now, Republicans usually feel like, the government doesn't get involved in the economy. You have a free market and free enterprise. But what he did is he froze rent, he froze wages, he froze prices, right? That's really taking a lot of control over the economy. Even labor didn't like it, though. They're like, this is Robin Hood in reverse. I guess what they wanted Nixon to do is freeze prices and increase wages, right? A lot of people said this is like crazy. They called it Nixonomics. The only thing is that it worked. temporarily, right? So once the price freezes were lifted, then we start to see inflation, the price of goods going up again. So his detractors, or people who were opposed to Nixon, really didn't like what his plan was. All right, so we also get the energy crisis. This was mostly in 1973. There were a few periods of energy crisis. It really became a big deal. We had gas guzzlers at that time, and we didn't even have SUVs, but just really, really big sedans and those sorts of things, and pickup trucks. So the demand for oil was really high, and as more and more countries industrialize, we see these oil-producing countries. They wanted to raise prices because the demand for oil was really high. So in 1960, there's this group that came together and formed the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. And what they wanted to do was raise prices, right? So they start to do that, and we consumed a lot, right? 2 times the rate of production in 1973. So prices really went through the roof. Then OPEC cut supplies to the United States because of our support of Israel during the Yom Kippur War. And so we would have these huge energy shortages here in the United States, and it was a huge crisis. So this chart shows crude oil prices historically in our nation's history. And this big spike right here is that crisis in 1973. And then the other one, this one right here, this was, oh my goodness, that was a horrible time. That was the recession of 2008. There was a drop in the housing market, and then the price of gasoline went up to like $4 a gallon. The period in between, relative calm, that's when we start to see a whole bunch of SUVs being sold, right? More gas guzzlers. But you can definitely see that big spike and how it became such a crisis. Okay, so if you look here, the OPEC nations today are all of those that are in blue. We are at a point right now where we produce enough to fulfill our needs, right? If you look over there, the U.S. states that produce oil, look at Illinois. There are quite a few. If you drive even from here to Decatur, that's probably natural gas, but there are a few places where they produce, and other locations too in the United States are using different drilling techniques to extract oil. But so we're not as dependent. One thing that's weird is Venezuela right here. They have a lot of oil, and they were doing really well until they changed their economic policies there, and now they're not doing so well. Okay, so oil import demand by country. This is kind of old, but notice that the United States is the greatest consumer of oil, right up there. In big cities, it's not that big of a deal, but for people out like us out here in rural areas to get to places, I mean, we do depend quite heavily on our cars. All right, OPEC net oil exports. So here's where they're exporting, right? So exporting continued to be on the increase during these years. So again, that's about, this was the spike in 73, and then this is going up to this other one, the spike in 08. All right, so we have this crisis here. The prices go up during 1973, 74. There's all these long lines for gas. You can see this one right here, I think. What is that per gallon? I can't read it. I know it's really low, but compared to today, it's on par with the cost of living and everything. Anyway, the embargo where they quit selling us gas, this was lifted in 1974. So that kind of alleviated the stress and the problems. Okay, so what does the government do? They do a few things. One thing is they impose this national 55-mile-per-hour speed limit. It was supposed to save like $3.4 billion or 3 billion gallons of gas a year. I know nobody wanted to abide by it. Can you imagine driving 55? Sammy Hagar's song, I Can't Drive 55. You're going to be listening to that on your video quiz. But anyway, we also construct this Alaskan pipeline, and this is a huge pipeline that goes from northern Alaska, where they drill for the oil, all the way down to the coastal area near Anchorage, and then from there it can be shipped out to the other parts of the United States. So we have that there. A lot of people think that this is bad for the environment. We have conflicting viewpoints on that. One thing that it's done, oddly enough, is it's really helped the caribou herds up there because they kind of use that big pipeline as a wind block. At least I read a story about that. But it does go along there. We have to protect that now too from sabotage or terrorists, those sorts of things. Another thing that the government did is they make a push to try to replace fossil fuels with nuclear energy, at least when we're powering, power plants and that sort of thing. So there's a push towards more nuclear energy. We also have the Atomic Energy Commission, right, where they say that the nuclear energy would produce half the energy by the end of the decade. We know that hasn't happened. One thing that people were concerned about and still are is that there could be some atomic energy or nuclear energy like accidents. You're going to see we're going to get the 3 Mile Island incident. I think we talk about that in section 3. No, we talked about it in section 4. All right, so there's a big push in the 1970s to clean up the environment. And so we get our first Earth Day. This was in 1970, and there was all these public service announcements and everything else. This was encouraged by the fact that things were so polluted. I know that when I was stationed in DC, some friends of mine had Jeeps. One had a Jeep, another one had a Jeep, and we all get into these Jeeps tops down. We drive along the Potomac River and we stop at this area and there's all these rocks where you could just dive off and into the river. And I went back and I was telling some older folks about it at my office, and they're like, "You swam in the Potomac River?" I'm like, "Yeah." Back in the 60s and 70s, you would not have done that because people would just dump all sorts of waste, environmental waste, into the waterways, or they would emit it out into smokestacks. And so people were really pushing to clean up the environment. And so we get, public service announcements. We get Earth Day. This was an organization that was put together by, it was a grassroots organization that did it. And it was inspired by the pollution that they saw all the time. And then this big oil spill was off the coast of California in 1969. So they do that, and so the government acts. That we get all sorts of new laws. We get the Clean Air Act of 1970, which says the standards of what you can emit into the environment, also what you can put into our waterways. So that was the Water Quality Act of 1972. And then one big thing, and Rachel Carson drew attention to this with DDT. There were species of animals that were becoming extinct, and one of them was a bald eagle, right? The bald eagle was in sure peril. Part of this was due to the fact the eagle would eat the fish, and the fish were in the waterways where there was DDT, right? And so they were dying from this chemical. And so they pass all of these acts, and then we're going to get the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is an agency within the federal government that's supposed to enforce all of these acts, right? So we get all of this legislation that comes through and Nixon signs off on it. So during Nixon's administration, he and Henry Kissinger, his national security advisor, who's going to become his Secretary of State, their foreign policy is based on the belief that the United States should do what's in the best interest of the United States. We're not going to worry about people in foreign countries and human rights violations because that's up to the other countries. And so we're going to do what's good for America. Kind of America first, but it's called realpolitik. And put that on the quiz, right? So that's the main focus really of the Nixon administration. So what Nixon does is he does like the enemy of my enemy is my friend, this triangulation. You would think that China and the USSR were good friends because they were both communists, but that is not true. As a matter of fact, they have this very long border between the two, which there's still a long border between Russia and China. But at the time when the Soviet Union was in existence, there was a lot of tension at that border, and oftentimes some little skirmishes that erupted. And the reason for that is that when Khrushchev became the premier of the Soviet Union, he diverged from Stalinist kind of world domination. They wanted the Soviet Union and Marxist-Leninist ideology to dominate the world. And Khrushchev said, no, we're not going to do that. We want peaceful coexistence. Well, Mao kind of thought that, Khrushchev and the Soviet Union had gone back on the policies that they should be embracing, and so there was a lot of conflict there. So these two, China and the USSR, were enemies, and Nixon says the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So what's he do? He goes to China. He pays a visit there in 1972 in February, and he talks to Mao Zedong. Now remember, we didn't recognize China as China. We recognized Taiwan as China ever since the Communist Revolution there. So Nixon goes to China and formally recognizes China as China. We have good relations with China, and by having good relations with China, we save face and can start to withdraw our troops from Vietnam, right? China kind of wants to be there too. Vietnam doesn't want China there either. They didn't want us there. They didn't want the French there. They didn't want the Japanese there. So anyway, we become friends with China, and that encourages the withdrawal of our troops. Now, troops aren't going to completely leave there until like 1975 when Gerald Ford was in office. So it goes through. We're going to have kind of a role in Vietnam during Truman's, then Eisenhower's, Kennedy's, Johnson, Nixon, and Ford, 6 presidents. Right. So anyway, so he goes to China, he travels the Great Wall of China, meets with Mao in 72. And then that same year in May, he negotiates the strategic arms limitation talks with Leonid Brezhnev. Brezhnev is the new leader of the Soviet Union. I wish I had my little nesting doll here. We could look at it. So this is going to lead to détente. That's that term here with a D and an accent on the E. T-E-N-T-E, détente. It's a French term, right? But anyway, so that is lessening of tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So this is really the beginning of the end of the Cold War, even though some would argue that we're still involved with it. I don't know. But anyway, so realpolitik and détente. You need to know those 2 terms on this slide. All right. So when Nixon goes there, China and Russia, their relationships were deteriorated. As I said before, he employs that belief, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So here, the U.S. is going to remove our forces from Taiwan. As a result, we recognize China as China, the People's Republic of China, and we get ping pong players coming here. There's this cultural exchange between the United States and China. Can anybody say Forrest Gump and ping pong playing, right? So we get that exchange there. Also, a lot of Chinese students start to come to the United States for college, that sort of thing. You can go and look at the University of Illinois. We have a large population who goes to school there. We also start trading with China, which we had not done before, right? And part of all of this, as I said, was that cultural exchange. So it really opened up relations between us and China. And here's a picture of Richard Nixon with Mao Zedong. Okay, so after meeting with Mao Zedong in February of 1972, in May, Nixon travels to Moscow, the Soviet Union, and he meets with their premier, the Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev. This is him here on the left who's talking to Nixon, right? He was going to be in for quite some time. But anyway, they reach a lot of agreements that really lead to reducing the number of nuclear weapons, and then also working together for different projects in space, right? Like the space station and things like that. So here's what we get out of this, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT. We're going to have SALT 1 and then SALT 2. During Nixon's administration, it's just going to be talks, right? Because he doesn't, I don't think anything's really finalized. It's going to be finalized under Ford and then Carter. We're going to get SALT too. But anyway, it limits the number of intercontinental nuclear missiles. So what we get are ICBMs, right? Intercontinental ballistic missiles, where you could fire them from one point on the planet to hit another point on the planet. It's not like, you know, Fat Man or Little Boy or whatever they were that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, where you had to fly them over and then drop them. Now you just, you know, launch them wherever they are. Now we just use computers to do it, as you all probably know. But anyway, it froze a number of missiles that were currently in use, and then it provided for you could have new submarine launch nuclear missiles, ballistic missiles, or intercontinental ballistic missiles. So they're kind of laying the groundwork for that. And, you know, it really alleviated a lot of the stress and tension and pressure and just fear that so many Americans had about nuclear holocaust, right? So it seemed like we were getting that lessening of tension. We were getting détente, right? Okay, so here's Nixon. This is their original agreement on SALT, the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, and perhaps he did sign off on it. Maybe he did. I can't remember specifically, but I know that he initiated it. He might have signed off on it. But we're going to get Ford too, and then Carter. So here's Gerald Ford, right? And this is the second meeting, and this is going to be at Vladivostok. So that's in November. What occurred at this time is, of course, that Richard Nixon had resigned because of Watergate, but we're going to talk about that in the next section. And then here's Jimmy Carter. This is SALT 2, and he signed off on it. So I think that Nixon's original, when he signed off on it, was just an agreement, and then we get SALT 1 and then SALT 2. So again, Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. All right, and then the last thing we're going to talk about are the events that were going on in Israel. So remember, when Israel was created back in 1948, all of its surrounding neighbors invaded, and Israel won. And then what happened is there's going to be a lot of tension against the United States because we ally with Israel. And that's going to bring about terrorist activity that is targeted at us. But anyway, so during this time, there's an incident that takes place, which is the Yom Kippur War. Again, all of Israel's enemies invade, and Israel just does this counterattack, and they get to the point where they get to like Cairo, Egypt. Then it looked as if the Soviet Union was going to get involved. The person who was the premier at the time, the prime minister of Israel, is this woman right here, Golda Meir, and a lot of people they credit her, what they call her, what the strong-willed, straight-talking, gray-bun grandmother of a Jewish people. So she was pretty fierce, right? And she's going to serve from 1969 to 1974 during Nixon's administration as the premier of Israel. All right, here Richard Nixon is with Golda Meir. The rest of the slides are all pictures. Right. This person here, I always ask in class, anybody know who this is? And you guys may not know who it is, but the man on the right who's on the crutches, who's shaking hands with Richard Nixon, is John McCain. He was a longtime senator from Arizona who served in Congress. He also ran for president. He ran against Barack Obama in 2008. But anyway, he is in his Navy uniform right here. Part of the agreement, the 1973 agreement with Vietnam, is that we would have a POW exchange. And John McCain had been shot down. He was a fighter pilot in the Navy during Vietnam, and he had been shot down, and he was in a prisoner of war camp for like 6 years, right? And so he's finally coming home, and boy, you know, you look at their face right there, you have to wonder what was said. But anyway, so that's Richard Nixon with John McCain. Here's Richard Nixon with Elvis. So you're going to watch a little segment about a movie that was recently produced. It's Nixon and Elvis. Elvis wants to go to the White House, but I'm not going to tell you why because then I'll give away the video quiz. But he walks up to the White House and he says, "Hey, I'd like to give this to the president," you know, and he ends up meeting him and they take this one photograph. And this is Nixon with Leonard Brezhnev. So Nixon first met him when he was vice president of the United States, and then Brezhnev was the premier while Nixon was president. But then we're going to get Brezhnev, or I'm sorry, Khrushchev, who becomes the Soviet leader. And this right here is Nixon with Khrushchev. And then this is Indira Gandhi. She was the Prime Minister of India. He's meeting with her at that time. Okay, last slide. So this last photograph was at Richard Nixon's funeral, and rarely do you see all former presidents get together. They get together sometimes for inaugurations of a new president or at the funeral of a former president. And when Richard Nixon died, you can see they're in order here. So you have Gerald Ford and his wife Betty, and then you have Billy Carter and his wife. I can't remember her name right now. Rosalind Carter. And then you get Ron and Nancy Reagan right here. And then you get George and Barbara Bush. And then this right here, this person was president at the time. That's Bill and Hillary Clinton, right? So I think that the only people still alive who are sitting there are the Carters. Right? I think both of them are still alive. All right. Well, thank you very much. See you with section 2.